I'm Peter Elston, and welcome back to this second video that I am doing with Michele Worden. Michele,
Good afternoon, Peter.
lovely to be doing this second video with you. The first video we did with you was on the subject of staffing.
Absolutely, yes.
And we went into a lot of detail. You went into a lot of detail about the issues with the nursing staff, not just nursing staff, but staffing generally. And this next video that we're going to do is on the subject of maternity care.
Yes.
So why don't you just give us a bit of background as to what this talk is going to be about, where it's going to start, etc.
Right. So I'm Michele Worden, and although I was the advanced neonatal nurse practitioner on the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester, I am also a registered midwife. So I recognise the importance of having good antenatal maternity care, because what happens while these babies are in the uterus has a profound impact on the state and condition that these babies are born in.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody seems to have discussed this in relation to these babies who were on the indictment for Lucy Letby. And there was obvious antenatal problems with lots of them. So during the trial, none of the babies, to my knowledge, had the mother's maternity notes given to the expert witnesses or the barristers involved in Lucy's trial. So the only antenatal information that we have about these babies comes from the baby's notes. So it is brief. And
but it shouldn't be brief. You're saying if there's important things from maternal history, that should be recorded fairly comprehensively in baby's notes. So it strikes me that if we go back to when the main medical investigator, Dr. Dowie Evans, joins the Cheshire Police investigation, and he's given the baby's notes, the clinical notes, but not the maternity notes, which seems to me an extraordinary failure on his part, because surely they are integral to these cases. He would have known that as a paediatrician, albeit a long retired paediatrician. But presumably, if you want to get the right answers, you have to ask the right questions. And to ask the right questions, you've got to have the right documentation.
Absolutely.
And a lot of that documentation was in these maternal notes that he didn't ask for.
He didn't ask for, and neither did any of the other expert witnesses, which they just relied on his statements. But as I said previously, the maternal information that is in the baby's notes is very brief. It's an overview. It's not in depth. And at no point did they call a obstetrician to give evidence in court. They didn't call a fetal medicine obstetrician who should have given evidence in court, nor did they ask them for any statement. So there is huge omissions from these babies. And looking at their notes, from what I have seen, every single one of them potentially had antenatal problems. So if we take baby C, we know that baby C had intrauterine growth restriction and had very little water surrounding him, which is the liquor, the amniotic liquor, which is a condition called oligohydramnios. And it is well researched and documented that babies who do not have enough liquor surrounding them are born with severe breathing problems. The lungs don't develop properly. So this baby had two major antenatal problems that were not discussed in court.
Mm.
And we know from Mr. James McCormack, who was the consultant obstetrician and the lead for the fetal medicine unit in Chester, that at Thirlwell, he clearly states, and I will quote, that it had been a very difficult pregnancy and that this baby had had severe growth restriction from 18 weeks. He says that he knows the cause of the growth restriction because of the placental biopsy post-delivery, and the examination of that placenta and the condition really causes a very abnormal change in the placental function. So the placenta was not working correctly.
Mm-hmm.
He then goes on to say, I presume that this death, that's the tragic death of baby C,
Mm-hmm.
was entirely consistent with prematurity. I knew that this baby was very sick as it had a very abnormal Doppler. Now, a Doppler is part of an ultrasound scan that monitors the blood flow through the placenta. And you can see whether that blood flow is normal, decreasing. And if it's decreasing and is very severe, you know that baby is not receiving the correct oxygen, the correct nutrients to grow. It's not producing the liquor. We know this baby had very little water around it, the liquor. So it all came together. But he was never called to court. He never came to court and said, I knew this baby was going to be born very sick. But that's what came out in Thirlwell, which is very interesting. And that is true for a lot of these babies, that we know from their baby notes via the experts who've looked at them, that nearly every single baby had antenatal maternity problems. And if a neonatologist had been there, I'm quite sure they would have asked for the maternal notes. But Dr. Evans didn't ask the right questions, as you rightly say. To get the right answers, you have to ask the right questions, or you have to look at the right information, and nobody did.
It also brings up the question, of course, of what the defence saw, because if the prosecution medical experts only saw the baby's notes, then there's this question as to whether the defence saw the maternal notes. Because if what you're saying is that the maternal notes are important evidence, then that should be disclosed to the defence. And we've got all sorts of issues now that are arising in relation to non-disclosure.
Absolutely.
It's the first day of the Thirlwell summing up today, and we know from Lucy's barrister Mark MacDonald that his CCRC application is going to set out examples of non-disclosure of evidence by the police, which of course is one of the major reasons why either trials collapse or why the convicted individuals are exonerated. So I don't know, but it's possible that these maternal notes are another example of non-disclosure. That's speculative because we don't know that. But on the basis that these maternal notes didn't play any role in any of the medical expert reports or were brought up at trial, one has to wonder why that was.
Well, Dr. Evans and the other expert witnesses for the prosecution portrayed these babies that they were well. And as you said before, we've heard all about how these babies were stable. But you can be critically ill in intensive care and still be stable for that specific period of time. But you're in intensive care for a reason. You're not well. You might be stable, but you are not well.
Yeah. And I think what we're learning is that with respect to the babies on the indictment, this prosecution assertion that the babies were stable is actually not correct. And we're also learning that the babies may well have been stable, but that there were very good reasons why they subsequently collapsed. Reasons that didn't involve inflicted harm, where there were identifiable natural causes
Yes.
for the collapse of a baby that was stable. 10 of the 17 babies were multiples.
Yes.
Which I suppose you're always going to get a higher incidence of multiples on a neonatal unit than you do in the general population, aren't you?
Yeah.
Because that's a risk factor.
It is a definite risk factor.
But do you have any sense of whether 10 out of 17 is high? I mean, it seems to me extraordinarily high, but then I'm not an expert. Do you have any thoughts, given your experience?
I mean, they are always at higher risk. So you do have a higher incidence of having multiple births on a neonatal unit, as you've just said. I am not a statistician, and I don't know how that compares with the normal singleton population being admitted to a neonatal unit. But certainly multiple births are at risk of far greater antenatal complications. But that's not to say it doesn't happen in a singleton pregnancy either. So I don't know. You'd have to talk to somebody whose math's better than mine.
Well, it just struck me, and I always get nervous when it comes to talking about medical matters, because I'm obviously not a medic. But it just struck me that the fact that, as we now know, that 10 of the 17 babies on the indictment were multiples.
Yeah.
That given that that's such a big risk factor, that must surely play a role as to why many of these babies had problems.
Yeah.
And of course, the whole the logic of the clinicians in relation to these deaths being unexplained and unexpected was that the reason for that was because the babies had been well, the babies had been stable. But as you've been saying, as we've heard from many medical experts, the babies weren't well.
No, by definition, if you're in an intensive care unit, you are not well.
Well, indeed, and that's presumably why the babies were on the neonatal unit, was because they weren't well.
Yeah. And I think going back to the trial, there were so many failings in regard of the evidence presented to these babies, and especially the fact that nobody looked at what had happened antenatally or during their pregnancies. Also, the deliveries of these babies, you know, lots of them were emergency cesarean sections. They needed to be delivered early for a variety of reasons. But again, without seeing the maternity notes, we don't fully understand why some of these babies were born early.
So, Michele, what you've done is you've set out in relation to many of these babies, the various issues that would have been picked up antenatally and how those played a role. But tell us a bit more about Dr. McCormack, is
McCormack, yes.
Who was head of the fetal medicine unit. Tell us a bit more about him. And
well, part of his role was also to collect and correlate very comprehensive data for the maternity unit and the neonatal unit. And when I was in post, I used to help collect the neonatal data. So the maternity data, immensely comprehensive, covers modes of delivery, gestation, maternal illness, babies with congenital abnormalities, vast amounts of things, how many women hemorrhage, how many women had episiotomies, etc. The neonatal data is equally comprehensive. So that is how many admissions you have, whether the babies were moved out to another unit, what the gestation was, whether they had intrauterine growth restriction, how many hours they were ventilated, the types of ventilation they had, etc. So it's very comprehensive data. And every 3 months, it is collected and correlated and presented in-house. So it would be presented in a data meeting, and that would consist of obstetricians, midwives, radiologists, neonatal nurses, managers, consultant paediatricians, junior doctors, across everybody involved in the care, either with the mother or with the baby. And then yearly, all this information is fed to the regional network, who cross-references to see outcomes compared to similar units and who's doing things well and who maybe has a higher cesarean section rate or whatever. And it looks at the demographics and the whole thing. So Jim McCormack is the head of the fetal medicine unit. Now, I was told by two separate people that following the increase in deaths in June 2015, there was a data meeting in the September or thereabouts. And at that meeting, Jim McCormack made a quip of, well, there's either really poor care on this unit or a serial killer at work. And when I heard that, I just thought, oh, why would you do that, Jim? He's a very charismatic Irish man. And I could see him making a quip. And I thought that's what it was. It was not a very good quip, but it was a quip. However, further down the road, when we get to May 2016, and this is now well documented, at another meeting, he stood up and pointed the finger at Ariane Powell, who was the neonatal unit manager, and said, in front of everybody, you are harbouring a murderer.
That sounds like a very inappropriate.
Very inappropriate. And
except it's what the entire prosecution case was, wasn't it?
Well, the medical staff at this point, across both sides, it is now obvious, because Jim McCormack's an obstetrician, he's not a paediatrician, were pointing the finger at Lucy. And we know subsequently that along with the consultant paediatricians who, when Lucy took out a grievance, were asked to write a letter of apology, that Jim McCormack also had to write a letter of apology, which was a non-letter of apology because it says, "Dear Lucy, I'm very sorry if I said inappropriate things about you, but I didn't name you. But I shouldn't have said it, but it doesn't matter because nobody knew it was you." So when I read the letter of apology, I thought, that's a non-apology.
Mm-hmm.
And again, at Thirlwall, Mr. McCormack said in his testimony that he was very surprised that Lucy accepted it because he didn't apologise for calling her a murderer. Now, by that same token, he didn't go to court and give any testimony on the antenatal care that these babies had, or the fact that, as he did at Thirlwall, he actually stood up and said, well, I knew baby C was going to be very sick. Nobody disclosed that during the trial. And to me, that's very important evidence. Because if he knew antenatally that that baby was going to be very sick, and it wasn't revealed to the defence or in the trial, that has huge implications on how the baby C story was told.
Yep. And we know that he didn't write any witness statements.
No.
And he, obviously as a result of that, he didn't take the stand.
No.
And
I think he was called to Thirlwall because he was named in Lucy's grievance and he had to write this letter of apology. But he didn't come forward in the trial. He, to say, well, I knew these babies were sick because they were under my care. And nearly every one of those babies would have been under the fetal medicine unit.
Well, it strikes me that his testimony would have been very influential
Very
if he
influential.
had taken the stand and set out to the jurors all
Yeah.
of these antenatal issues that he was responsible for monitoring.
Yes.
That might have really.
And I think it goes back to the parents as well. I mean, I feel dreadfully sorry for these parents because they've obviously had difficult pregnancies. Their babies have been born premature, sick, maybe difficult deliveries. Their babies have tragically passed away due to many reasons. And they've been told that they died of natural causes.
Mm.
And then 3 years later, they have the police knocking on the door saying, actually, we think this is a malicious act.
Mm.
And they've had to sit through, or certainly in the case of baby Kay's mum, 2 trials, but a very lengthy first trial of 10 months. And now all this information is coming out. We know that one of the parents has said, well, we don't need all of this because we think we've got the truth. We know we've got the truth. But as a parent, I really do want them to have the truth, and I don't think they have it. And I don't want this happening to any other sets of parents. And I certainly don't want on my conscience an innocent nurse in jail when this could have just all been the perfect storm coming together. And tragically, babies do die. It was reported in the trial that, or on one of the programs, I think it was Operation Hummingbird, that, you know, it's a shock when babies die. Well, it is a shock when babies die, but it doesn't mean that babies don't die, because unfortunately they do.
Yes, and I recall the article which quoted the mother of one of the babies saying, "We've already got closure."
Yeah.
But of course, there were 17 babies.
Absolutely.
And 34 parents.
Yeah.
So we're only talking about one
set of parents
out of 34
yes.
who has said that they already have closure. And we don't know what the parents of the other babies are thinking.
No.
But it was quite instructive that it was only the one mother who said that.
Yeah. Yes, the other parents, in fairness, have been very quiet, and I do wonder how many of those other parents are asking questions now, because speaking as a parent, I would definitely want to know the truth, and I'd want to know the truth because if it is a system failure and suboptimal care, which we now have seen in many other hospitals, Shrewsbury, Nottingham, Morecambe Bay, the list goes on, I want it to stop. I don't want other mothers and babies to endure what these families have had to go through, and the families in Shrewsbury and Nottingham and Morecambe Bay, etc.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I've said is that in many respects this case is horribly complex, but in other respects it's actually very simple. It's about 2 groups of doctors who told stories.
Absolutely.
You had the clinicians who told the story that Lucy Letby is a serial killer, and then you had the prosecution expert doctors who came along and essentially set out reports as to how Lucy Letby murdered or attacked these babies. And obviously what is now coming to light is that these doctors were wrong. And clearly there are many victims. One of the key victims is obviously Lucy Letby, but obviously you've got the parents of the babies who were victims of these doctors. And in some respects, you can argue that the hospital, the executives were victims of these doctors. And let's recall, after the verdicts, the clinicians, Dowie Evans, Sandy Bowen, coming out and laying the blame at the feet of the hospital for not listening to them.
I think this is multifactorial. If you just take Dr. Evans, he is on record of saying, I went to Chester Police Station, I said, give me a set of notes, and within 10 minutes, over a cup of coffee, I knew this was an inflicted liver injury. Now, I know some of the expert neonatologists who have been instructed by Lucy's new barrister, Mark MacDonald, and they have spent weeks poring over these notes, hundreds of pages of documents, of x-rays, of blood results, of observation charts recording minute to minute what was happening with these babies while they were in intensive care. So I think alarm bells should have rung with Cheshire Police when Dr. Evans, within 10 minutes, knew that this was a malicious act.
It's obviously a very unprofessional thing to say, this conveying the idea that it was easy.
Yeah.
Particularly when it actually turned out that his evidence for this baby having been attacked, the baby's liver having been attacked, was wrong. Not only because he was invoking bruising, external bruising over the liver that turned out not to be bruising. But also he pointed to this attack taking place at 1 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
When Lucy wasn't on
Lucy wasn't
duty.
even on duty, no.
And when he made the statement about within 10 minutes, knowing there had been inflicted harm, this was after the trial.
Yeah.
When he knew that what he was saying about the external bruising, about what he said originally in his witness statement about 1 o'clock in the morning, he knew that was all wrong. And that strikes me as
well, I think we have numerous...
The many disingenuous things that he
we have numerous examples of this. So, for example, with baby C, the X-ray that had a huge gaseous bubble in it was shown and said that Lucy had injected air down the nasogastric tube, was taken on a day when Lucy wasn't on duty. And Lucy hadn't been on duty the previous day either.
Since the baby's birth.
Since the baby's birth. So Lucy had been nowhere near this baby. So there's lots of discrepancies like that make no sense and are completely incorrect. Yeah.
And in fact, with there was the article in Unheard magazine by David Rose, where he looked at Evans' opinions that he set out in October 2017 in relation to 28 babies, and he pointed to 10 specific clinical events when it turned out Lucy was not on duty, and he reconstructed a roster chart instead of the one shown to jurors at trial with an uninterrupted line of 25 X's. He reconstructed a chart showing 10 gaps. Yeah. Which, of course, blows the entire case apart and should have blown the entire case apart right back at that point in time.
And that was yet another thing that the jury were not told about. The jury were not told about the Royal College of Paediatric report. They were not told that Lucy wasn't on duty for many of these events. They weren't talked through how flawed the roster chart was. There's just so many discrepancies that really must raise serious alarms. But yeah.
And of course, the topic of this discussion is the antenatal information.
Yeah.
Which, as you've said, was missing from the trial.
Nobody discussed it.
It wasn't discussed by any of the prosecution medical experts. It absolutely
and it wasn't discussed by the defence. It wasn't discussed by either side. Wasn't mentioned. And there was no consultants obstetricians called to give evidence, and certainly none that specialise in fetal medicine, which is a huge admission.
Well, in relation to one bit of information, that antenatal bits of information, namely whether babies were singletons or multiples, and as you've said, that's a major risk factor. 10 of the babies on the indictment were multiples. Now, I've actually submitted recently a Freedom of Information request to the Countess of Chester, asking for information both in relation to births and neonatal admissions from over a 10-year period, including 2015 and 2016, which was this period of elevated mortality. They've been dragging their feet a bit, but hopefully that information may give us a better idea of how this issue of multiplicity, what role that played in relation to the period of elevated mortality. In fact, the Royal College of Paediatrics report did refer to a higher incidence of multiple births. So we already know that, there's something there, but if we can get some really good quantitative data, then I think that could help us to understand even better as to what is going on with that. And it's not just the sort of multiple birth factors, is it? It's all of these other antenatal factors that you've talked about. Yeah,
there's not just the antenatal factors, but there's also this crisscrossing of babies around the region, the lack of level 3 intensive care cots. So babies are up and down motorways. I mean, if you take baby K, that mum was on labour ward for 3 days, and they looked at transferring the mum out while the baby was still in utero. And the nearest level 3 intensive care bed was in Preston, which is 60 miles away. And it was deemed too dangerous to transfer that mother. Preston is not within the region, which shows that the level 3 units within the region were full. We also know that North Wales had 19 episodes that their maternity hospitals were closed for undisclosed reasons, but those mums and babies have to go somewhere. So did they come to Chester? We know that the twins that were supposed to be born in Liverpool were transferred to Chester because Liverpool didn't have any beds.
So what you're saying is that these closures in North Wales may have meant that the level 3 units in this northwest region may have become full and weren't able to take the babies, which instead had to go to Chester.
Yes, they had to go somewhere, and there's problems with the transport team. So the transport team...
Which is another issue that was highlighted in the Royal College report, that there were issues with the transport
and was
network.
Never discussed in court, that when the transport was originally set up, it was the Merseyside Regional Transport Unit. It covered North Wales, Cheshire and Merseyside. It always had problems. And in 2015, it was decided to amalgamate with Greater Manchester. So the transport team now is the North West Transport Team, and it's covering North Wales, Cheshire, Merseyside, Lancashire, Greater Manchester and Cumbria. That's a huge geographical area and is in many parts quite a rural area. So difficulty with main roads. It's not like London where you've got lots of hospitals very compact. This is a huge area. So there is delays in picking up, there's delays in collecting, there's delays in transferring back. It's one unholy mess, really, and it all needs to be looked at.
Yeah. Well, certainly, Michele, the main topic of this chat has been the sort of antenatal notes and care and the issues highlighted antenatally that should have been presented at the trial. And it's been fascinating to hear you talk about what we would have learned from those. Is there anything else you want to say about the sort of antenatal aspects of these cases?
No, I just think it was a huge omission that these experts didn't obtain the mother's antenatal notes, and I think it could have given a greater insight into why these babies were born prematurely or had problems.
Yeah. Well, Dowie Evans had been retired for 8 years by the time he joined the investigation. Perhaps he'd forgotten that
Perhaps he had.
these antenatal notes were
and I certainly think if it
or even existed.
I certainly think a competent neonatologist, if they'd have been the expert, would have definitely have looked at the maternity notes.
Michele, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Peter.
Until next time.
Good to see you.